I drove into Willow Creek at dawn, expecting a quiet visit to my mother. Instead, I found my childhood home overrun by roaring machinery and the pungent smell of fresh asphalt. The glaring sun reflected off the shiny blacktop as if to mock me. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and construction crews swarmed around the yard where my mother's rose garden used to bloom. I froze in disbelief at the sight. Her pride and joy, gone, replaced by a hastily paved parking lot that stretched from the tip of our old mailbox all the way to the back fence. I could barely process the devastation. When I glanced to the side porch, I saw her, my mother, shoulders trembling, wiping tears from her eyes. My gut twisted in rage. How could anyone justify leveling an entire rose garden, meticulously nurtured for decades, just for a bunch of parking spaces? The sign perched near the construction entrance provided the only explanation I had: parking for Willow Creek Neighborhood Association. My blood boiled at the words, but the real shock came when I realized it was the local HOA behind this blatant trespass. My mother never agreed to anything of the sort, so how did they have the nerve to do this? And more importantly, how was I going to stop them? I'm James Cooper. I'd grown up in Willow Creek, a small town in Colorado where everyone seemed to know everyone else. My mother spent most of her life here, cultivating roses in every imaginable shade of pink, red, and ivory. Her garden was legendary among the neighbors, with some calling it a piece of living artwork. After I moved to the city to pursue a career in finance, I often felt guilty about not visiting more, but I still carried cherished memories of that garden, of warm summer nights chatting on the porch, breathing in the sweet fragrance of newly bloomed petals. Standing there now, watching the final rose bushes crushed under the massive tires of a forklift, I vowed I wouldn't let this injustice stand. It wasn't just about the flowers, it was about the principle. My family worked hard for that land. No one asked my mother for permission to turn her yard into a communal parking space. This act was more than a simple property dispute. It was an affront to everything we cherished. I rushed to my mother's side, noticing the thin lines of exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain the situation. It started about 2 weeks ago, James. A woman from the Homeowners Association, some official named Ms. Genevieve Parker, came by with a clipboard and said they needed extra parking for a new complex. I told her this land wasn't for sale. Then all of a sudden these men showed up with bulldozers. She said if we didn't comply, we'd face escalating fines or worse. My mother's voice quivered at the last word. Something about the way she said "or worse" told me they'd intimidated her beyond mere fines. She'd never been one to scare easily, but these individuals had obviously found her weak spot, possibly threatened her in ways I couldn't imagine. My first move was to confront one of the workers, a heavy-set man in a neon vest who was busy marking lines on the pavement with white chalk. "Who gave you permission to pave this property?" I demanded. He looked at me with utter confusion, or perhaps feigned ignorance. "I just do what the HOA tells me. They said it's already approved." My hands clenched into fists. "Who approved it?" I barked. He simply shrugged, muttering something about the county permits posted in the HOA's main office. I marched over to a cluster of workers huddled near a crane, but they all repeated the same line: "Talk to Ms. Parker." That name again. I was determined to find her. Before I could continue my search, my mother tugged at my arm, pointing toward a sleek black SUV pulling up along the curb. Out stepped a tall woman in her 40s, with perfectly styled hair and an air of unshakable confidence. Her black blazer caught the morning light, and she strode toward us with a folder tucked under her arm, as though this entire fiasco were a routine matter. This had to be Genevieve Parker. She offered a curt smile that felt more like a sneer. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper," she said, ignoring me completely. "Is your signature ready for the final contract? We need to finalize the expansion." My mother just stared, speechless. Rage rippled through me like a bolt of electricity. "Who are you and why are you on our land?" I snapped, my voice echoing across the parking lot. Miss Parker turned her gaze on me, arching a brow. "I'm the current president of the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association," she replied, calm as a cucumber. "Your mother has been informed of our plans. This area was deemed necessary for overflow parking. Her property is within our jurisdiction. Don't worry, we'll reimburse you for the fair market value of the land. She acted as though she were doing us a favor by steamrolling my mother's cherished garden. I scoffed at her nerve, but I also noticed a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She probably wasn't used to someone fighting back so openly. She attempted to hand me a sheaf of papers, presumably some sort of contract. I let them slip right through my hands, fluttering to the ground in a scattered pile. "We never agreed to this," I said flatly. "Get your machines out of here before I call the police." Ms. Parker's lips thinned. "Then call them," she said in a measured tone, lifting her chin defiantly. "You'll find we have every legal document in order." The confidence in her voice made my stomach churn. Could the HOA really have the law on their side? It seemed absurd. This was private property, my mother's property. If they'd forcibly taken it, it meant there might be corruption lurking beneath the surface, maybe involving local officials who had ties to Ms. Parker. My old instincts kicked in. After all, I spent years learning the ins and outs of finance and real estate in Denver. If there was foul play, I'd sniff it out. I used my phone to take pictures of the ongoing construction, capturing the frantic bustle of men pouring fresh concrete over what used to be fertile soil. I also took pictures of the scattered roses. Torn, flattened, worthless. That small act felt like the first volley in a coming war. Ms. Parker didn't even blink. She merely walked away, presumably to oversee her crew's progress. My mother and I retreated inside the house, the only place that still felt remotely safe. Her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old coffee, a stark contrast to the chemical stench just outside. She explained how the HOA had apparently rezoned several properties in the neighborhood to accommodate a new luxury condo project. That new development required more parking than they'd initially allotted, so they decided to annex additional land. My mother's property was in a prime location close to the main road. She showed me letters, threatening letters, each with official-looking stamps, claiming she'd be fined thousands of dollars for non-compliance with city ordinances. Several had arrived in the past few days, piling up on her dining table. She felt powerless. My father had passed away years ago. My mother, living alone, didn't have the energy or resources to wage a legal battle. She tried calling City Hall but got the runaround. She tried contacting a local attorney, but he told her the HOA likely had deeper pockets and strong political connections. Hearing this, my anger flared like a bonfire. I was done watching bullies pick on someone who couldn't defend herself. Still fuming, I decided to call an old friend of mine from law school, a man named David LeGrand. He was known for dealing with real estate disputes, not so much in small towns, but in bigger cities. He agreed to meet me the next day in Willow Creek to review the case. That evening, while my mother tried to find some solace in her knitting, I took a long walk around the property. Well, what was left of it. The parking lot looked finished in some sections, lines painted, signage posted. My footfalls echoed on the new pavement. This entire project must have cost a fortune, and the HOA was moving with military precision to get it done. That was suspicious. Typically, HOAs can't just crush gardens without dealing with weeks or months of paperwork, permits, and potential lawsuits. Something told me Ms. Parker was getting help from local officials who might be skimming money off the top or receiving political favors. As I turned toward the setting sun, the last traces of my mother's roses caught my eye. Bruised petals scattered across the black top like confetti from a funeral. Right then, I silently promised I'd make every one of them pay. Early the next morning, David arrived dressed in a gray suit and carrying a stack of reference books that looked heavier than my mother's kitchen table. He wasted no time diving into the documents I'd collected. He thumbed through pages of fine print and frowned. "This is unusual," he admitted, glancing up at me, a furrow of concern creasing his forehead. "HOAs can enforce community standards, sure. But they're not usually allowed to just take private property unless it's explicitly deeded to them through some older covenant or local regulation." My mother, wearing the same worry on her face, offered him a fresh cup of coffee. He continued, "I see references to a rezoning effort, but normally that'd require multiple public hearings. Did the county inform you? She shook her head. Not a single letter from them that explained anything, only these intimidating notices from the HOA. David let out a slow exhale. I suspect corruption, he said flatly. We need to find out how exactly they're bypassing the normal checks and balances. Over the course of that day, we discovered an unsettling trend. Half a dozen neighbors had also received letters from Miss Parker's HOA pressuring them to allow expansions, fences, or other modifications on their land. 2 neighbors told me privately that they felt cornered, like they had no choice but to comply. One friend, Miss Hampton, said she faced $5,000 in fines for an unauthorized garden fence that had been standing for nearly a decade. Now they say it's in violation of some new code, she explained, trembling as she spoke. I live on a fixed income. There's no way I can pay that. The more I heard, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA was systematically targeting properties that would in some way benefit their bigger development plan. If that meant wiping out rose gardens or spooking elderly folks with fines, so be it. Late that afternoon, I confronted Miss Parker again. This time while she was speaking with a group of local officials near the newly painted parking lines. She dismissed the men with a wave of her hand when she saw me approach. I recognized one official from the town council, a man named Mason Ward, who looked visibly uneasy as he hurried away. Miss Parker faced me, her stance composed, her smile nowhere to be seen. Mr. Cooper, I trust you've found a way to see reason? She asked. The condescension in her tone set my teeth on edge. We both know this expansion you're doing is an abuse of power, I spat back. Either you show me the legitimate permits right now, or I'll... She cut me off with a slight chuckle. You'll do what? She challenged, her posture unwavering. From what I understand, your mother can't afford a lengthy legal battle, and I doubt you want your precious family home tied up in court for years. So let's just say we have the upper hand. I clenched my jaw, forcing down the urge to lash out physically. She arched an eyebrow, then handed me a business card. If you want to discuss settlement terms, call my office, she said, turning on her heel. That smugness stuck in my head all day. I knew Miss Parker was leaning on her connections, likely sweetening the deal for certain local officials to keep the project rolling without too many questions. But she had no clue about my background. She saw me as just another small-town kid with limited resources, unprepared for a bureaucratic nightmare. However, she didn't realize I'd spent years evaluating complex mortgage-backed securities, forging partnerships with banks, even acquiring distressed properties. Most important, she couldn't possibly guess the biggest trump card I held, one I'd never had reason to think about until now. My late father had left me not just memories but significant financial assets. Assets I'd carefully grown and invested. Over time, I'd gained partial ownership in a local credit union that held the mortgage for many properties in Willow Creek, including some of the association's own developments. I hadn't taken a close look at those specific accounts, but a burning curiosity now drove me to check every detail. If Ms. Parker was fueling this entire expansion with borrowed money, or if the HOA was using financing from the credit union I had a stake in, I could cut their supply of funds at the source. David and I spent the next few days digging through public records, mortgage deeds, and corporate filings. The more we uncovered, the more we realized just how tangled the HOA's finances were. They had multiple loans consolidated under the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association name, cross-collateralized with a new condo development, plus a line of credit for expansions. The primary lender turned out to be Willow Creek Financial Services, a subsidiary of the credit union in which I owned significant shares. My mother, unaware of the complexities, had never realized how deep my involvement with local lending went. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began to fit together. Ms. Parker was essentially using borrowed money to fuel these aggressive expansions. If that money were to dry up, or if the mortgage terms were to be called into question, it would be a devastating blow to her entire operation. I decided to test the waters. Through David, I contacted a friend in the underwriting department of the credit union to confirm that the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association had indeed borrowed substantial sums to finance the condo project. He confirmed it, a hint of admiration in his voice at our thoroughness. The association was precariously leveraged. Any significant disruption in their revenue streams or an increase in loan interest could cripple them. If Ms. Parker had known I was part owner of the credit union that held her mortgage, she would have likely tried a less confrontational approach from the start. Still, I wanted to be sure. I needed to gather overwhelming evidence of the HOA's wrongdoing so that, when I played my trump card, it would be unassailable. David arranged for a private investigator to look into the behind-the-scenes deals Ms. Parker might have struck with local officials. Rumors circulated that she'd promised them certain privileges in the new development, free condo units, or a chunk of the HOA's fees. That would explain why so many people in town hall were turning a blind eye. Meanwhile, I reached out to members of the local press, telling them an explosive story was brewing, a corrupt HOA forcibly seizing property under the guise of city ordinances. Though smaller newspapers in the area tended to shy away from controversy, the reporter I spoke with sounded intrigued. She smelled a big scandal. While the investigation simmered, my mother and I tried to regain a semblance of normalcy. But every time we opened the front door, we were confronted by that ugly stretch of pavement. The beautiful rose garden she'd nurtured for decades was now a chaotic parking lot, filled with strangers' cars at all hours. Sometimes, rowdy visitors from the new condos held impromptu gatherings on our front step, as though it were just another public space. My mother was too frightened to confront them, so she'd stand by the window, wringing her hands in helpless frustration. Watching her anguish lit a fire inside me. I refused to let her suffer in silence. I resolved that no matter what, I'd find a way to push back. The tension continued mounting day by day. Additional letters from the HOA arrived, some with monstrous fines. One stated that my mother owed $1,200 for failing to maintain the aesthetic standard of communal areas, ironically referencing the now-paved rose garden. Another threatened legal action if we didn't remove private possessions from the parking area, objects that were presumably the remnants of my mother's garden decor. It was beyond absurd. Then came the final straw. Ms. Parker posted a notice on the front door, claiming that the HOA had the right to claim partial ownership of the house itself if the fines went unpaid. That was it. My patience snapped like a brittle twig in a storm. Without warning, I marched straight to Ms. Parker's temporary office, set up in a trailer near the construction site for the new condo towers. "We need to talk," I declared the instant I spotted her inside. She barely glanced up from her desk. "Make an appointment," she retorted, but I slammed my hand on the table, scattering her perfectly aligned documents. "I don't need an appointment, Miss Parker. My mother's property is not yours to claim. You're trespassing, and this whole operation is one giant sham." She stared me down, then slowly rose to her feet, arms crossed. "Listen, Mr. Cooper," she hissed. "We have the local council, the planning board, and half the neighborhood in our corner. You're just one man who's about to lose a pointless battle." My heart pounded, but I forced a smile. "You're wrong about one thing," I replied in a controlled tone. "I'm not just one man." I watched confusion flicker across her face before I left her standing there, breathing heavily. The real fight began the following week. David managed to schedule a meeting with the county zoning committee to formally challenge the HOA's rezoning permit. We brought along a petition signed by over 20 local residents, some of whom had mustered the courage to speak out against Miss Parker's overreach. The hearing was tense. Miss Parker arrived surrounded by a small entourage, including a polished attorney in a pinstripe suit. She presented flow charts and diagrams that painted her project as beneficial for the community. She claimed the additional parking supported local commerce, reduced street congestion, and improved real estate values. She conveniently omitted the fact that she'd bulldozed an old woman's rose garden without consent. When David questioned her on that point, she waved it off, saying my mother's property had always been subject to association guidelines. A blatant lie. My mother never signed any document placing her land under the HOA's jurisdiction. The hearing ended in a stalemate, with the zoning board deciding they needed more time to review the matter. Ms. Parker shot me a triumphant grin on her way out, as if to say, "Keep trying, it won't matter." But behind the scenes, I was working on a plan that would matter a great deal. After reconfirming my ownership stake in the credit union, I quietly reached out to the board of directors, explaining the precarious nature of the association's finances. They were surprised but intrigued by the revelations of potential corruption. Under normal circumstances, a bank or credit union might hesitate to sabotage a large borrower, especially if the interest payments were profitable. But the possibility of legal fallout, especially if the HOA had acquired their loans under false pretenses, made them reconsider. We discussed the option of reevaluating the mortgage terms, or even calling in certain debts if a breach of contract was discovered. It was a nuclear option, but Ms. Parker was playing dirty and I was ready to fight fire with fire. Shortly after, David received a call from our private investigator. He'd uncovered multiple instances of Ms. Parker and her cohorts forging inspection reports to pass environmental and safety regulations for the new condo site. They'd manipulated local codes to speed up the construction schedule, skipping mandatory community hearings. Several of the forging jobs had Ms. Parker's name written all over them. This was the break we needed: hard evidence of fraudulent behavior. Armed with that, we planned our next move. We decided to set up a public community meeting at the local high school gym, inviting residents to air their grievances. Our friend from the local newspaper agreed to cover it. At first, Ms. Parker tried to paint the event as a biased attack on her leadership, but that only drew more attention. On a Tuesday evening, the gym was packed with angry neighbors, worried senior citizens, outraged families, and a handful of nervous local officials who still wanted to see which side would come out on top. The mood was electric. The moment Ms. Parker entered, flanked by her attorney, the crowd began murmuring in disapproval. She maintained a stiff composure, as though the entire affair was beneath her. I stepped forward to present the evidence of fraud. Every eye in the room was on me as I clicked through slides showing the falsified signatures, the suspicious timeline of permit approvals, and images of the bulldozers razing my mother's once pristine garden. Gasps echoed through the bleachers. Ms. Parker's attorney attempted to interject, calling the evidence unverified. That's when David pulled out sworn statements from the private investigator and two whistleblowers who claimed Ms. Parker pressured them to expedite the condo project by any means necessary, under threat of losing their jobs or facing lawsuits from the HOA. The crowd erupted in chatter. It was as though a dam of pent-up frustration finally burst. Ms. Parker's face went pale, and for a moment she looked as though she might storm out. But she held her ground, no doubt hoping she could salvage the situation. Suddenly, from the back of the room, a shaky voice rang out. It was Miss Hampton, the retiree who'd been forced to pay exorbitant fines for her garden fence. She stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and recounted the intimidation tactics the HOA had used. Letters threatening to seize her home if she didn't comply. She described how Miss Parker personally showed up one evening telling her that if she didn't remove the fence, the fines would increase daily until she owed more than her house was worth. The crowd's mood shifted from shock to outrage. Miss Parker's attorney tried to quiet Miss Hampton, but no one listened. Another resident chimed in, speaking of how Miss Parker's enforcers had vandalized his small greenhouse when he questioned the new condo expansion. More accusations spilled forth, painting a damning portrait of a woman who had used fear and brute force to bend the community to her will. Sensing the tide turning, Ms. Parker tried to regain control. "This is a witch hunt," she declared, raising her voice to command attention. "We've done nothing but follow the best interests of Willow Creek, ensuring a prosperous future for everyone." But it was too late. The damage was done. People stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. She shot me a glare that could have frozen molten steel, but I refused to be intimidated. Instead, I delivered the final blow. "And, for the record," I said, letting my voice carry across the silent gym, "the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association's mortgage is held by a credit union in which I happen to own a controlling interest. You may have local officials in your pocket, Ms. Parker, but your entire development rests on money you've borrowed from me." A wave of stunned whispers swept through the crowd. Ms. Parker's composure cracked right there. Her eyes widened and she actually staggered back half a step. In that moment, she realized she'd tangled with the wrong family. The meeting ended in a burst of reporters firing off questions. Ms. Parker and her attorney fled under the barrage while residents remained behind, filling the space with anxious talk of next steps. Over the following week, the story gained momentum. Local newspapers ran front-page headlines about the fraudulent permits, quoting outraged neighbors. City Hall was forced to acknowledge a formal investigation into Ms. Parker's dealings. The entire condo project was put on temporary hold under the glare of public scrutiny. And then, the credit union made its move. They called for an immediate review of the HOA's mortgage terms, citing substantial evidence of misconduct and fraud. If Ms. Parker couldn't comply with the revised terms that required an instant cessation of any illegal expansions, she risked foreclosure on the entire project. Faced with this financial stranglehold, Ms. Parker tried to negotiate a deal with me personally. She called me one afternoon, her tone devoid of the earlier arrogance. She begged to meet in private, hoping we could work something out. I was tempted to ignore her call, but David advised me to hear her out, if only to see if she'd reveal anything that could help our legal case. So I arranged a meeting at a local diner, a neutral spot where we could talk without prying eyes. She arrived early, looking worn down, her hair slightly disheveled and her perfect posture wilted. When she started speaking, her voice cracked. "James, I'm sorry about the rose garden," she said softly, glancing at her hands, which fidgeted atop the table. "I didn't realize how important it was to your mother, but it's too late to undo the construction. Maybe we can come to a financial arrangement." The apology, half-hearted as it was, didn't move me. "You bulldozed my mother's life's work," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady, "and you bullied countless other residents. You only regret it now because your entire operation's at risk." She sighed, staring at a coffee cup that she didn't bother to sip. "I had no choice. The developers demanded more parking spots if we wanted them to invest. Without the condo project, the HOA would face massive debts. The association was already on the verge of default before I took over. I did what I had to do." Her words carried a trace of desperation. I almost felt a pang of pity, but then I remembered the agony in my mother's eyes. Our meeting ended abruptly when I told her I had no interest in a private deal. "This is a community matter. You need to be accountable to everyone you've wronged," I stated flatly. She bit her lip, nodded grimly, then left without another word. I sensed that her bravado was gone, replaced by a woman cornered by her own ambition. 2 days later, Ms. Parker tried a different tactic. She called a press conference, claiming she'd present evidence proving the HOA's innocence. But the event turned into a fiasco when she couldn't refute the forged permits, or the fact that multiple residents had been coerced into accepting improvements. The press hammered her with questions. Furious, she stormed off the makeshift stage, while camera flashes documented her humiliation. Meanwhile, the official investigation into Ms. Parker's relationship with local officials moved forward. Mason Ward, the town council member I'd seen with her earlier, was suspended pending further review. Whispers circulated of bribes and secret real estate deals. As more facts emerged, Ms. Parker's allies abandoned her. Even her attorney withdrew representation due to irreconcilable differences. The condo development ground to a halt, leaving half-built structures and a big deserted parking lot where my mother's garden once thrived. Ironically, that idle lot became a constant reminder of greed's destructive potential. With the HOA strapped for funds and under legal scrutiny, it was only a matter of time before Ms. Parker faced the consequences of her actions. The final showdown came in a hearing at the county courthouse, presided over by a judge known for her intolerance of corporate bullies. Ms. Parker represented herself, looking weary in a crumpled blazer. David and I presented our evidence, the forged permits, the threatening letters, the statements from residents who'd been strong-armed into compliance. The judge listened intently, then turned to Ms. Parker. "Do you have any evidence that counters these claims?" she asked, her gaze stern. Ms. Parker tried to stammer out an explanation about best interests and community development, but it fell flat. She had no proof, no plausible defense. The judge declared her in violation of numerous codes, recommending a thorough state-level investigation into possible fraud and abuse of power. After the hearing, Ms. Parker was escorted out by deputies, her expression dazed. The court seized the HOA's financial accounts, placing them under a form of receivership to protect homeowners from further exploitation. As part of the settlement, Ms. Parker was barred from serving on any community board again. For the first time since I returned to Willow Creek, I felt a surge of relief. Justice had finally begun to prevail. With Ms. Parker's downfall, the city allowed the battered residents to reclaim some of what was lost. The bulldozed parking lot remained an eyesore, but the new caretaker appointed by the court promised to help restore the land to its former state. Volunteers poured in, bringing fresh soil, seeds, and saplings of rose bushes to replant. My mother's eyes shone with tears of gratitude as neighbors who'd once been too frightened to speak out arrived to help. Little by little, we pulled up the asphalt, discovering small patches of earth that still remembered how to bloom. It would take time, but the rose garden's spirit was far from dead. Through it all, I learned a hard but vital lesson. Sometimes, the only way to fight corruption is to shine a bright light on it and refuse to back down, no matter how intimidating the opposition appears. Miss Parker and the Willow Creek HOA wielded their power brazenly, believing no one would dare to challenge them. But they hadn't counted on me owning their mortgage, hadn't anticipated that I could sever the financial lifeline that fueled their aggression, nor had they expected a community that, once awakened, would rally around an elderly woman's rose garden as a symbol of hope and defiance. The aftermath wasn't just about replanting flowers. It was about healing wounds, reconciling with neighbors who'd suffered under the HOA's yoke, and rebuilding trust in a town that once prided itself on neighborly values. My mother's resilience amazed me. Despite her heartbreak, she embraced the project of restoring the garden with renewed vigor, planning to plant more diverse rose species than before. Every time I knelt beside her in the dirt, gently tucking new roots into the soil, I thought about how easily we could have lost everything. Our property, our legacy, our sense of community, if we hadn't stood up to Miss Parker's tyranny. My mother spoke of hosting a grand reopening for her garden once the flowers were in full bloom again, complete with tea and pastries for every neighbor. That idea made me smile, imagining the yard brimming with color and laughter. In time, local authorities dismantled the shady alliances that had enabled Ms. Parker's ascent. Several officials either resigned or were voted out by residents fed up with corruption. The condo development, once the talk of Willow Creek, transformed into a cautionary tale about unchecked power. Some of the partially built structures were repurposed into community centers and affordable housing once the city stepped in to manage them responsibly. The forcibly annexed properties returned to their rightful owners. Ms. Parker faced multiple lawsuits and potential criminal charges, ensuring she wouldn't soon forget the day she met her match. As for me, I remained in Willow Creek much longer than I initially planned. My mother needed help tending the newly planted roses, and the town needed people willing to speak up if they saw injustices brewing. Whenever someone asked how I managed to single-handedly dismantle the HOA's stranglehold, I insisted I hadn't done it alone. It took the courage of neighbors who shared their stories. It took journalists eager to expose the truth. It took the unwavering support of David, who knew how to navigate the legal minefield. It took the steadfast spirit of a small-town community that, once awakened, refused to submit to bullies. One evening, well after the dust had settled, my mother and I sat on the porch overlooking the revived rose beds. Golden light from the setting sun lit up the pink blossoms, highlighting the fresh growth sprouting from tender stems. A sense of calm enveloped the yard, as if nature were breathing a collective sigh of relief. My mother squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for standing up for me, for all of us." I merely nodded, words failing to express the gratitude and pride I felt at that moment. Sometimes, you have to fight with every resource you have to protect the people and places that matter most. That's the lesson Ms. Parker taught me without meaning to, that beneath a calm exterior lies a fury ready to defend what's right. Now, whenever I see a neighbor leaning over the fence to chat, or I hear children laughing as they circle through the yard on their bikes, I'm reminded of how close we came to losing it all. The parking lot is gone, replaced by the renewed promise of living beauty. The new buds hold the future, and each day they blossom a little more, just like the hope that once seemed out of reach. Even the local paper ran a headline, "From Parking Lot to Paradise, Willow Creek Reclaims Its Roots." People from nearby towns came to see the transformation, marveling at how quickly the community bounced back after the scandal. It became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power ordinary citizens wield when they unite under a just cause. Months later, as the final lawsuit concluded and Ms. Parker lost her last appeal, life in Willow Creek found its equilibrium. Residents held a celebratory gathering on the town square. Local musicians played folk tunes, and booths offered homemade pies, crafts, and produce. I walked around greeting people who'd once felt isolated and voiceless. Their smiles radiated relief and triumph. My mother, wearing a sun hat, sold small bunches of freshly cut roses, each with a ribbon that read, "From Ms. Cooper's garden, hope blooms anew." Folks bought them eagerly, placing the flowers in their hair or their shirt pockets, as if wearing a badge of communal pride. The media eventually turned its attention elsewhere, and the hype surrounding our victory faded. Yet the deeper change remained. City officials established stricter oversight on HOAs, requiring public hearings for any major property changes. Lawsuits forced transparency in how association dues were spent. Best of all, older folks like Miss Hampton no longer lived in fear of losing their homes to contrived HOA rules. I realized how transformative public accountability could be. Once the secrets were out, the bullies had nowhere to hide. A few weeks after the final resolution, David came to visit, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. He and I walked down the street, pausing at the newly landscaped corner where Miss Parker once parked her flashy SUV. "You did it," he said, gesturing at the vibrant gardens all around. "You saved not just your mother's roses, but a whole community's sense of fairness." I shook my head, acknowledging that it was a collective effort. Then I admitted something I'd only recently come to understand. "You know, David, maybe I needed this too. I'd spent so long in the city, chasing opportunities, I almost forgot what it felt like to stand up for a place that actually matters to me." He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Well, next time you see corruption, you'll know exactly where to start." We ended the day back on my mother's porch, drinking iced tea while the sunset painted the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. She watched the horizon with a peaceful smile, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh blooms, roses that by some miracle of nature and perseverance had returned to their rightful home. I listened to her talk about how she planned to expand the garden, maybe add a small pond or a gazebo. For the first time in a while, her words brimmed with genuine excitement. The fear and despair were gone, replaced by hope. A sense of serene victory settled over us as the sun dipped below the rolling hills. That's the story of how our rose garden was crushed beneath asphalt, then resurrected through unwavering resolve. The HOA thought they could trample on someone they saw as powerless. They believed fear would keep us compliant, but they underestimated the bond between a mother, her son, and a tight-knit community unwilling to stand idle. And of course, they had no idea I literally held their entire mortgage in my hands. Once they messed with the wrong family, their grand plans collapsed like a house of cards. Perhaps the biggest lesson is that you never truly know someone's strength or hidden resources until you push them too far. For me, it took a travesty to rediscover why Willow Creek mattered, not just to my mother, but to all of us who call this place home. Now, the new roses sway gently in the breeze, offering a silent reminder that justice, like those flowers, can rise from the darkest soil. And as for Ms. Parker, she learned that bulldozers and threats can't bury the truth for long. Justice may be delayed, but eventually it always finds a way to bloom.